A World of Trouble. The White House and the Middle East, from the Cold War to the War on Terror, by Patrick Tyler. Narrated by Michael Prichard. Copyright 2008 by Patrick Tyler. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Prologue. America in the Middle East. Night had long since fallen over central Saudi Arabia in early 2004, when George Tenet came trudging out of his bedroom in Prince Bandar bin Sultan's palace and asked for Scotch whiskey. In Riyadh, the capital of a conservative Islamic monarchy where alcohol was banned and women were not allowed to drive, it was possible in the cloister of the Saudi royal family to grant this wish to the American Director of Central Intelligence. Tenet had retired for the evening, or so the household thought. His security detail was bedded down. It was unusual for a CIA director to have such a close relationship with a foreign envoy, but Prince Bandar was an unusual figure, having served for more than 2 decades in Washington as ambassador to 4 American presidents, having traveled the globe on discreet missions for his king, and having nurtured long-standing friendships, almost familial in character, with George H.W. Bush and his son, George W. Bush. The CIA delegation had arrived late and eaten sumptuously from a buffet of lamb, salad, and sweets that Bandar's staff laid out. A CIA bodyguard and 2 senior officers, the director of the CIA's Near East Division and the agency's general counsel, had accompanied Tenet for the overnight. The CIA station chief, based in the kingdom, had joined them, as had Prince Salman, Bandar's younger half-brother. But Tenet's group was tired and groggy from a tough itinerary that included a high-security stop in Iraq. The next morning, they were headed for Amman, Jordan. Tenet took a sleeping pill, and Bandar walked him down the hall to the guest room and said good night. But 15 minutes later, the door to Tenet's room opened and closed. The director was stalking the elegant corridors in search of the prince. Bandar and his closest aide, Rehab Massoud, were still up watching television in the family room, which offered an inviting splay of well-stuffed divans oriented toward a wall covered with large-screen televisions. This high-tech array, with 9 news channels on display at once, was a feature of Prince Bandar's villas, manor houses, and chalets around the world. One wall of the broad living area was glass, which opened onto a large veranda paved with the blond native stone of Central Arabia, and overlooking a sparkling pool and a grove of date palms. Each year, the dates were harvested and sealed in vacuum packs to be delivered as gifts to friends of Prince Bandar and his wife, Princess Haifa, the youngest daughter of the late King Faisal. On one wall, a portrait of Bandar's grandfather, King Abdul Aziz Al Saud, the tall and powerfully built warrior who had unified modern Saudi Arabia and who had cast the country's lot with America, looked down on them with a stern visage. The prince had just suggested to Massoud that he too stay over because it was already 1 a.m. They were talking about Iraq and the troubles that had befallen the administration of George W. Bush when Tenet reappeared, disheveled in his boxers and T-shirt, and with thunder in his mood. "I can't sleep," he said. A servant appeared with a bottle. Tenet knocked back some of the scotch. Then some more. They watched with concern. He drained half the bottle in a few minutes. "They're setting me up. The bastards are setting me up," Tenet said. "But I am not going to take the hit." The prince understood what Tenet was talking about. Someone had to take the blame for the missing weapons of mass destruction, the overarching pretext for the war in Iraq. And Tenet was raging against the realization that the White House expected him to fall on his sword to protect the president. As the Scotch melted what was left of his restraint, Tenet began to flail verbally at his enemies, the assholes in the Pentagon, the crazies and sneering ideologues in the White House, especially around Vice President Dick Cheney. According to one witness, he mocked the neoconservatives in the Bush administration and their alignment with the right wing of Israel's political establishment, referring to them with exasperation as the Jews. More Scotch, more invective. After arriving in Riyadh, Tenet had spent part of his time on his secure phone back to Langley, sometimes shouting over the instrument to his deputy, John McLaughlin. "Fuck you. No, we are not going to take this. We've picked enough shit off our backs." Those were the lines that echoed in Bandar's ears, and it seemed that Tenet was spitting mad, negotiating indirectly with the White House on what would be said about the intelligence meltdown. "I am going to protect the agency and my ass," Tenet had stated emphatically. Tenet was going to need a lot of protection, because by early 2004 the sham of the pre-war intelligence had been revealed. David Kay, the veteran United Nations weapons inspector and chief of the Iraq Survey Group in Baghdad, had abruptly resigned and stated publicly that he didn't think Saddam Hussein had possessed any stockpiles of chemical or biological weapons. "We were almost all wrong, and I certainly include myself," he told the Senate Armed Services Committee on January 28th. Kay had seen enough to conclude that it is highly unlikely that there were large stockpiles of deployed militarized chemical and biological weapons there. Not only Americans were shocked. Many Iraqis, scientists, military men, and Ba'ath Party officials had assumed, as the CIA had, that Saddam maintained hidden stockpiles of weapons. We weren't smart enough to understand that the hardest thing in intelligence is when behavior remains consistent, but underlying reasons change, Kay told the senators. Though Saddam had built a terrifying military mystique based on chemical warfare in the 1980s, the Iraqi dictator's desire to end United Nations sanctions impelled him to destroy his arsenal. Apparently, it was as simple as that. Even Saddam, after his capture, admitted he had kept up the pretense that he was armed with weapons of terror. "You guys just don't understand. This is a rough neighborhood." After Kay's bombshell, Secretary of State Colin Powell said that he too was having second thoughts about the war based on Kay's testimony. The absence of a stockpile of chemical or biological weapons in Iraq changes the political calculus, he told the editors at the Washington Post, pointing out that the Americans had overwhelmingly supported the war with the understanding that there was a stockpile and there were weapons that posed significant threat to the United States and its allies. Powell all but retracted his remarks the next day, but the damage had been done. For many Americans, such candor from inside the intelligence establishment was both illuminating and devastating. It didn't matter that the survey group had reaffirmed Saddam's capacity to reconstitute his illicit weapons program, or that he had been developing ballistic missile systems that might deliver new weapons in the future. It didn't matter that Saddam had killed or scarred tens of thousands of Kurds and Iranians with nerve agents or mustard gas, or that he had been twice discovered developing nuclear weapons. Hadn't the Israelis destroyed Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981 to block one effort at getting an atomic bomb. And a decade later, UN inspectors discovered and destroyed a second and more advanced nuclear program. All that mattered in the winter of 2004 for many Americans, and Britons as well, for they had been mobilized for war by the same intelligence claims, was that they had been colossally misled. Kay said that it was important that we acknowledge failure. But acknowledging failure was not something that came easily to the Bush administration, when so many lives had been taken and so many billions spent on a war that had bogged down into a costly, low-intensity conflict against Iraqi insurgents and an influx of al-Qaeda operatives. The White House had begun erecting its defense. Bush had relied on Tenet and the CIA in making the final decision for war based on the unambiguous CIA assessment that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. The slam-dunk case, as Tenet had famously referred to it. Tenet knew that, in the end, he bore responsibility for the final intelligence judgments on Iraq that were presented to Bush. The national intelligence estimate that the CIA had produced, and that had served as the foundation of the administration's case for war, was Tenet's product. And it was wrong. Tenet had tried to defend himself in public. In the intelligence business, you are almost never completely wrong or completely right, he said in a speech at Georgetown University days after Kay's testimony. The CIA painted an objective assessment for our policymakers of a brutal dictator who was continuing his efforts to deceive and build programs that might constantly surprise us and threaten our interests. Now the flaws in the CIA's analysis, its deductive leaps, the unreliable sources were coming back to haunt Tenet's doorstep. And the sulphurous tone that was filling Bandar's spacious family room suggested to the prince that his friend had made up his mind to leave the administration. "My run is done," Tenet had told his top aides on the plane coming out to Saudi Arabia. "We did our job. We called it like we saw it, but this is going to be a rough period, and I think I want to get out." The lines of loyalty and trust that had sustained Tenet in the Bush circle had snapped. Now the question was whether Tenet would leave with a modicum of dignity, or whether his enemies in the White House would drive him out unceremoniously, because Tenet had always had detractors among the neoconservatives. It was also an election year. The 9/11 Commission report was due out, and Tenet knew that the CIA was going to get blasted for having withheld critical information from the FBI about 2 of the 9/11 hijackers who had been in the country for 18 months before the attacks. Bush had been one of Tenet's defenders. "Tenet's under lots of pressure, but I'm going to stick with him. I like him," Bush had confided to one of his Iraq advisers the previous October. To Bandar, Tenet was a lot like Powell, instinctively loyal, protective of the boss, and a strong member of the team. Neither was martyr material. They might remonstrate privately, but that was just part of the process of giving in to the inevitable realization that they would have to leave. "I would like to go swimming," Tenet suddenly announced. Bandar and Massoud exchanged looks of alarm. Tenet was clearly too drunk to swim. All that scotch on top of a sleeping pill? How long would he be conscious? They followed closely out into the warm midnight air of Riyadh as Tenet rumbled down the stairs, still in his underwear, and threw himself into the water. Somehow Tenet managed to hold on to a Havana cigar and a glass of scotch. But his watch flew off, and CIA aides dove to the bottom of the pool to retrieve it. There was the Director of U.S. Intelligence, bobbing up and down, trying to recover his mood with humor and defiance. He did impressions of Yasser Arafat and of Omar Suleiman, the Egyptian intelligence chief who loved to make sport of how fat Ariel Sharon, the Israeli prime minister, had become. Tenet gazed down at his own mountainous girth. He had gained 35 pounds during his directorship. "I'm a pig," he shouted into the night. Bandar watched from a stool by the bar where a Pakistani servant was mixing drinks. Let the guy have a swim. It was the least he could do for Tenet. Bandar had observed 5 American presidents from close quarters, and he recognized the political excision that was under way. There was nothing Bandar could do to save the best friend he had ever had in a CIA director. Though the anti-terror war had gotten brutal, Bandar believed that Tenet had performed a great service to the United States and to its allies. No CIA director, not even the legendary William Casey of the Reagan era, had worked as effectively in the Middle East to build an intelligence alliance that actually worked behind the veil. Tenet had a gift for personal relations. He laid on hands. He shared gossip about despots and potentates, and he kept secrets. He had won the confidence of the Arabs as well as the Israelis. He demonstrated American trust by presenting key foreign leaders with CIA secure phones that enabled them to speak to the president or his aides without risk of interception. Among the first to receive them had been the Saudi royal court and the Israeli prime minister's office. Bandar had his own CIA phone that traveled with him. These intelligence relationships continued to function even when diplomatic channels were roiled by George W. Bush's hard edges or the unilateral bent of his foreign policy. Tenet had done an unparalleled job of organizing America's allies against Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda in the wake of the September 11th attacks. He had dispensed hundreds of millions of dollars to the intelligence services of moderate Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco, and to allies in Eastern Europe and Asia. He had built a formidable coalition and expanded agent networks in the Muslim world. He had shared technologies to put terror suspects under surveillance. He had broken down barriers, sharing raw voice cuts, conversations intercepted by the National Security Agency, with foreign intelligence services so native Arabic speakers could help identify them. Tenet had been especially attentive to Saudi Arabia. He had traveled personally to the kingdom the year before to present the evidence to Crown Prince Abdullah, the day-to-day ruler, that al-Qaeda was planning to assassinate members of the royal family, and that al-Qaeda cells were shopping for Russian-made nuclear weapons. Tenet's warning, delivered with Prince Bandar at his side, had led to a broad crackdown on al-Qaeda in the kingdom. Tenet and the CIA had taken the gloves off in the war on terror. He had overseen the rendition of terror suspects who were dispatched on CIA planes to secret prisons or interrogation facilities in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. He had overseen the development of controversial interrogation methods, such as waterboarding, a simulated drowning that incites gagging and panic. It had been approved by Bush for use in these secret chambers. To any reasonable person it was torture. But Tenet had been prepared to employ and defend such techniques because he and the president believed, they later said as much, that they could preempt new terror attacks with the information. Those were the days when the American public overwhelmingly supported taking strong measures to prevent another attack on the U.S. homeland. The details of the CIA interrogation techniques were highly classified. The public was unaware, until long afterward, that George W. Bush had sanctioned torture in 2002 and 2003 against major al-Qaeda operatives in captivity. In April 2004, when the Abu Ghraib prisoner abuses were documented in Iraq, public revulsion set in. The instinct to take the gloves off dissipated when Americans saw what it had led to. Tenet's case had to be handled carefully. Bandar, too, knew that the president had very specifically and graphically instructed the CIA to do what was necessary to extract information about possible terrorist attacks. Bush had expressed himself brutally in meetings that Bandar had attended because Saudi Arabia was a full partner in the American coalition to destroy al-Qaeda in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. "Why can't we send them to be tortured?" Bush had asked in one such conversation about al-Qaeda suspects. "Stick something up their ass," Bush had said. America was at war. Bush was willing to authorize tough tactics, even torture. "Look, I just can't afford to see any more people in America die," he rationalized. Some of the scenes involving Bush that Bandar and Tenet had witnessed in the wake of 9/11 had been Strangelovian, and there were going to be court cases, maybe even criminal charges over the treatment of detainees. Bandar felt that the White House would be making a big mistake if it assumed that allegations of torture and detention in secret CIA prisons were going to be Georgia's problem. Tenet had made it clear to Bandar that he was not going to be the fall guy. Everything the CIA had done, it had done with the authorization of the president, with review by the Attorney General and briefings to key members of Congress. They both knew who had authorized the CIA to do what. Now Tenet was going down. Bandar deeply regretted his departure from the CIA because Tenet, along with Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, and Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, represented an informal cabal during the George W. Bush years. They understood the Middle East in the way Bandar did, that it was essential to work for peace in the Holy Land because the tragedy of Palestinians living under occupation for 40 years represented an open wound that profoundly affected attitudes not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world as a reservoir of grievance, passion, and anger. It fed the psychology of righteous retribution, the terrorist instinct, on the streets of Gaza, Ramallah, and Jenin, but also among those Islamic clerics throughout the world who preached an extremist course to impressionable young Muslims. The four of them, Blair, Powell, Tenet, and Bandar, had worked in different ways, and at times in concert, to encourage George W. Bush to pursue a more pragmatic policy in the Middle East, one that balanced a determination to use military force to protect American interests with a humanistic agenda to bring an end to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories and to establish a viable Palestinian state. Their energy was arrayed against an equally formidable policy cabal that also had the president's ear, including Vice President Dick Cheney, his chief of staff, Louis Scooter Libby, Elliott Abrams of the National Security Council, NSC staff, and, in the Pentagon, Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Defense Secretary, and Douglas Feith, the Deputy Secretary for Policy. This neoconservative group of senior officials and their aides appealed to the president's idealism in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. They urged him to think of his presidency as a mission to expand the boundaries of freedom while ruthlessly attacking terrorism. The Palestinian cause was a sideshow, and Arafat had discredited himself by playing the terror card when it suited him. They defined terror as an all-encompassing evil in the Orwellian sense that ignored historic grievance or local political context. In this worldview, any state or political movement whose most militant adherents resorted to violence was the enemy. Tenet might be taking the fall, justifiably, for the pre-war intelligence blunders, but he also was walking away from the larger struggle to define America's interests more pragmatically in the Middle East, and that was a struggle that connected him and his like-minded colleagues back through the line of American officials to Eisenhower and Dulles, to Truman and Roosevelt, each of whom laid down foundation stones of American policy based on self-interest, a strong sense of justice, and a magnanimous American spirit. Tenet believed that Bush had the strength, the vision, and the will for great achievement in the Middle East. He could use those strengths to do what was necessary to close the deal, to create a viable Palestinian state that had been put on the table during Clinton's final days in office. And both he and Bandar were disappointed by Bush's delay and prevarication. The Prince was the most reluctant to give up on Bush. Over 25 years, the former F-15 pilot had become a phenomenon of Saudi-American relations, with unparalleled access to the White House, but also to European and Asian capitals. He was rumored to maintain a private dialogue with the director of Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, about the requirements for Middle East peace. He lobbied both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush on a secret nuclear initiative. Would Washington consider putting moderate Arab nations under a NATO nuclear umbrella as a hedge against the growth of Iran's power? And he used his private channel to Bush to make the case for setting a timeline for creating a Palestinian state at peace with Israel before he left office. The White House was 7,000 miles away across desert and ocean, but its wires were still intimately connected to Bandar, the westernized prince of the House of Saud, and to Tenet, the beefy son of Greek immigrants from Little Neck, Queens, who was now wrestling with the beast of his disappointment in Bandar's pool. It was tragic, and the intensity of the scene inspired surreal fantasy. What on earth would they do if he drowned? In the annals of U.S. foreign policy, Tenet's last night in Riyadh in April 2004 was not unprecedented. Other powerful men had been unhorsed or come unglued in the bureaucratic wars fought over policies forged confidently in Washington but played out disastrously overseas. Tenet was not the first or the last senior member of the Bush administration to suddenly recognize the cleavage between traditional American ideals and the ideological cant and whimsy emanating from the White House. Powell would follow him out the door by the end of the year. The collapse of the intelligence underpinning the invasion of Iraq, Tenet's political demise, and the bloody insurgency that has claimed tens of thousands of lives and inflicted an incalculable cascade of destruction during the U.S. occupation of Iraq, was the most current expression of a half-century of costly miscalculations in the Middle East, the sum of which have deepened the American predicament. This book is a history of the American experience in the Middle East over the past half-century. It is a story of 10 U.S. presidents and how they engaged or confronted the region and its leaders. The particulars are taken primarily from the declassified record of successive administrations, buttressed by interviews with key players, recollections drawn from memoirs, oral histories, and other accounts. My aim is to understand, and to help the reader understand, the chaotic and very human perspective with which our presidents look out at the world while remaining tethered to politics at home. It is essential to say at the outset that this narrative leads to a surprising conclusion about U.S. foreign policy. After nearly 6 decades of escalating American involvement in the Middle East, it remains nearly impossible to discern any overarching approach to the region such as the one that guided U.S. policy through the Cold War. And, after endless cycles of conflict, an alarming buildup of arms, civil strife, and an escalation of religious confrontation, American leaders have been unable to agree on a firm set of principles, a consistent set of goals, or a course of action that could bring peace and stability to the Middle East. What stands out is the absence of consistency from one president.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?